Well, welcome to this presentation on genetic testing. If you haven't seen the link to this commercial first, I want you to watch it. It'll give you a little more of a background as to why we're taking a look at genetic testing and what can be done with it. There are some things that we're going to refer back to as we go through this unit, back to this commercial. So again, if you haven't seen it yet, please do take a look at it. It describes a little bit about being able to collect some saliva samples, send that off to a company and have them sequence that information for you, your DNA sequence, all for $99. But there's some limitations and some things to consider, and so again, please do watch that commercial. So pause this, watch it, and then come back. If you have watched it, then here's some additional background on genetic testing. First, genetic testing looks at chromosomes, looks at genes, look at proteins, basically anything that determines your traits. Of course, your chromosomes we can look at and count up how many you have. If you have an extra 21st chromosome, for example, we know that that's going to lead to Down syndrome. We can look at your DNA sequence, as we're going to do as part of a lab activity later in this unit. And then we could also take a look at the proteins. And of course, the genes encode how to make a protein, and so we don't need to look at the instructions when we can just look at the final product. For example, with sickle cell anemia, it's the result of a misshapen hemoglobin protein. Well, we don't need to look at your gene for hemoglobin to know whether or not you have the version that works, when we can just take a look at the protein itself. Genetic testing looks at inherited disorders and can tell you whether you are definitely going to get something, in some cases whether you're likely to get something but not guaranteed, and in other cases simply saying that you are it's possible that you might get something, that maybe something like a colon cancer is 25% more likely than the rest of the population, which isn't the same thing as 80% more likely or 100% guaranteed. We're going to look at all those cases here too as we work through this unit. Different types of genetic testing include ones such as predictive testing. With predictive testing, it's kind of like what it sounds, that we are predicting what you might be getting later on in life based on your genes, based on your DNA sequence. We can detect genetic mutations for disorders that appear after birth, and so predicting, again, what's going to be coming up ahead of time or ahead of you in your life. Huntington's disease, as you're going to see in a video segment here coming up, we can look at your sequence of DNA and say for sure that you're going to get something, whereas breast cancer and colon cancer, we can only tell you that you are more likely than others to get that. At the same time, this can be very helpful to people who have a family history of any of these genetic disorders to say that you definitely won't, or that maybe you will, and also can be used to confirm a diagnosis. That if we're not sure why a certain set of symptoms have shown up, it could be an infection, but at the same time, maybe there's a genetic reason for these symptoms. Newborn screening. Everybody here in Wisconsin and in most states across the United States are screened for 48 different genetic disorders. They take the infant's heel, jab that against a needle, and collect the blood on a card, and that card contains blood cells that they send off to be extracted and analyzed. The DNA from that will let the technician know whether there's a genetic disorder that usually involves something that, usually metabolic, which means that there's something that isn't getting processed correctly during digestion and absorption. And some examples of that include things such as genetic disorders that are, genetic disorders such as ASA. ASA stands for argininosuccinic acidemia. Arginine is one of the amino acids that's found in proteins. And if we are not capable of breaking down arginine, then ammonia builds up, and that ammonia can eventually lead to brain damage. The only problem is that if we wait for the symptoms to show up, then while the treatment would be avoid getting arginine in your body, at that point the damage has already happened. And so if we can do the testing right at birth and show that this is something that an amino acid they need to avoid, then we can change the diet, limit the amount of arginine in the proteins that they eat. It's not as simple as it sounds, but at the same time, making sure that they don't get something toxic in them is a good idea. This is true not just for different types of amino acids. Remember, there are 20 different amino acids, and there's a whole bunch of different metabolic disorders that deal with inability to process amino acids in your foods, but also relate to things such as fatty acids that are found in your foods. Same idea. If we wait for the damage to happen, it's too late. So diets that are containing different types of fatty acids, as well as others where avoiding sugars like galactosemia. And it doesn't always have to be a genetic disorder related to food items that you should avoid, but also things like cystic fibrosis, where if we just know at birth what the genetic disorder is that that child will have, we can start to begin treatments that might help out. So newborn screening. Carrier testing. Remember back to genetics that you could be an individual that is heterozygous, that you have a dominant gene and a recessive gene. If that's the case, you are a carrier. You yourself are normal in terms of traits, but it's possible that you might pass on a trait to your child, especially if your spouse has a recessive disorder too, or at least is carrying that recessive disorder. And so this can be done for people who have a family history of recessive genetic disorders, or maybe coming from certain ethnic groups where genetic disorders might be more prevalent, such as Tay-Sachs. Tay-Sachs does happen in other populations, but seems to be more common in people of a certain ethnic background called Ashkenazi Jew. And so in those communities, it's highly recommended that they get tested because they themselves are fine. With Tay-Sachs, you die by the time you're 5. But if you know that you're a carrier, and the person you decide to have kids with is a carrier, then of course you either make different decisions about having kids, or at least go into the process eyes wide open as to exactly what can happen. We don't have to wait for you to be born to be testing your DNA. We can do prenatal testing. And so this is done before birth to look at the chromosomes typically that are found in the cells in the amniotic fluid that surrounds the fetus. Remember, those cells are coming either directly from the fetus or from the placenta, which the fetus produced way back during the blastocyst stage. From those cells, we can count up the number of chromosomes and again take a look at things like Down syndrome. Doesn't mean that we have any treatments for Down syndrome, but at least would let the parents know what is happening and what can be possible with that birth. And then lastly, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis involves those embryos that are produced during IVF. We're going to spend a lot more time with this later in the unit, but the basic idea is that if you know that there's a genetic disorder in your family, and we look at those embryos, we extract one cell, not all of them, we're not doing embryonic stem cells, but take one cell from that blastocyst, analyze the DNA, and we can determine that maybe embryos 1 and 3 will get Tay-Sachs, but embryo 2 definitely won't. In which case, when it comes time to implant that child or implant that embryo back into the female, then we would choose embryo 2, the one that does not have Tay-Sachs. So in some ways, with PGD, you can choose the traits of your kids. Not to contain things that we don't have. If you're not going to be 7'2", or at least don't have those genes, then your child is not going to be super tall either. Nor is it going to have any genes in there from things like genetic engineering. We can't make our kids glow in the dark with the GFP protein if we're using PGD. But at the same time, you again can avoid genetic disorders. But as we'll see with this the further investigation of PGD, it's also possible to pick and choose eye color and hair color and blood type and height and a variety of other things too. So we'll analyze that a little bit further later. At this point, though, I'd like to refer you to the packet of responses that you should have at this point. And with that packet of responses, I'm only going to have you do this first one. We'll look at the others together in class at some point. But this first one is about Huntington's disease. And you're going to meet Katie. Katie has Huntington's disease, but her story is very interesting. And what I want you to be able to do is answer those questions. Hold off on doing the response. I want you to listen to one short little presentation once that video is done. So find the link in the calendar, listen in on the Huntington's disease presentation or that video, and then come back and listen to just a short little segment so that you can do your response.